They say weddings are meant to crown love with glory, to seal two souls in vows spoken before family, friends, and God. But every so often, a celebration becomes a weapon. Every so often, the applause hides secrets, the laughter covers whispers, and the one who walks down the aisle is not walking into love, but into judgment. This was no ordinary wedding. The chandeliers glittered, the tables overflowed with gold, and the guests, powerful, proud, dressed in their finest, believed they were witnessing the union of a man who had conquered life and love. Daniel, wealthy, admired, untouchable. He wanted this moment to be remembered, not for devotion, but for domination. You see, Daniel had a plan. An invitation was sent, an invitation no one expected, to a woman he once called his wife. Grace, the woman who built him in silence, only to be abandoned once fortune came. She was invited, but not as a guest of honor. No, she was summoned as a symbol, a reminder of his past struggle, brought before the world so he could humiliate her in front of the rich and powerful. But Daniel never understood that humiliation cuts both ways, that the stage you prepare for another's disgrace might just become the very stage of your downfall. And so, as the music played and the crowd smiled, Grace stepped into that glittering hall. What Daniel believed would be the crowning of his triumph was about to become the unraveling of his empire. Before the truth reveals itself, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? Tell me in the comments, because staying silent in stories like this has a cost. Grace had been silent for years. To most of these guests, she was a ghost, a chapter closed. Yet tonight, her presence was impossible to ignore. She entered with calm dignity, every step a quiet defiance. Daniel, at the altar, felt his confidence falter for the first time. His smile remained fixed, but his eyes darted, restless. He had crafted a scene of perfection, an orchestra playing, roses cascading in ivory vases, servants gliding between tables. But perfection is fragile. Behind the silk and music, the air carried something else. Unease. Some guests whispered. Some noticed the way Daniel clenched his hands too tightly, and though no one spoke it aloud, there was a question in the room that hung heavier than the chandeliers themselves. Why was Grace here? The night before this wedding, Grace sat alone in her small apartment. She had received the invitation weeks earlier, and at first she thought it was a cruel mistake. But then a message appeared, a photograph. Daniel, smiling with another woman, standing in the very hall where tomorrow's vows would be spoken. Attached to it were words few could ignore. You should see what you lost. Grace read it over and over. It wasn't just arrogance, it was a challenge, a trap. He wanted her there, to mock, to shame, to prove that he had risen while she had fallen. But Daniel underestimated the quiet fire of a woman he thought broken. For that night, Grace made her choice. If she was to walk into his world again, she would not walk in as a victim. She would walk in prepared. Listen carefully. If you think betrayal could never find its way to your door, you're wrong. Share this story with someone you care about, because one day they might need the warning. The morning of the wedding arrived draped in gold sunlight, as if the heavens themselves wished to anoint Daniel's day of triumph. Limousines glided through iron gates, polished shoes clicked across marble steps, and jewel-studded gowns shimmered in the light. The air outside the grand hall was filled with laughter, cameras flashing, and music meant to celebrate. But for Grace it was different. She stood at a distance, watching as guests poured in, each step of theirs carrying an unspoken arrogance. They believed they were walking into a fairy tale, yet Grace knew this fairy tale was built on deception. She straightened her dress, plain but elegant, and whispered to herself that she was no longer the fragile woman Daniel expected to see. She was something else entirely now. Inside, Daniel moved among his guests like a king in his court. Every handshake, every compliment, every staged smile was part of his performance. He drank in the admiration, savoring it like fine wine. But beneath his confident gestures, there was a tightening in his chest. Because while the guests saw only a flawless groom, Daniel's eyes kept scanning the entrance, searching for the figure he both longed to humiliate and secretly feared. And then, she arrived. Grace's entrance was quiet, but it carried more weight than the blare of trumpets. Conversations faltered, heads turned, and for a brief moment, even the orchestra seemed to lose its rhythm. She did not rush, she did not cower. She moved with the calm of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to expose. Daniel's smile stiffened. He expected her to arrive timid, diminished, desperate to hide in the back of the hall. Instead, she held herself with composure, walking past glittering tables, her gaze fixed not on him, but on the truth she carried within her. The bride-to-be glanced nervously at Daniel, sensing a tremor in the man she thought invincible. Grace took her seat, silent, her expression unreadable. But in her silence was power, for silence at the right moment can be louder than the sharpest cry. The ceremony began. The priest's words rose above the room, solemn and sacred, yet Daniel heard little of them. His mind was not on vows or blessings, but on the presence of the one woman who could unravel everything he had built. He shifted on his feet, forcing himself to smile, yet his eyes flickered again and again toward Grace. And as the moment of vows drew near, Grace moved. She did not rush the aisle. She did not create chaos with words. She simply stood, and the air itself seemed to change. Guests gasped, the bride trembled, and Daniel's mask of control cracked before the eyes of everyone who once worshipped him. Grace stepped forward, not to stop the ceremony, but to expose what the ceremony had hidden. Her presence was the question no one dared to ask. What had Daniel sacrificed? Whom had he betrayed? And why did the ghost of his past stand unshaken in his moment of supposed triumph? The whispers grew louder, a storm moving through the hall. Guests turned to one another, wondering, doubting, questioning what they had believed. The music faltered, the priest hesitated, and in that silence, Daniel's empire of illusion began to tremble. Because Grace was not there as a relic of Daniel's past. She was there as a mirror of his truth, a truth about to shatter the world he tried to construct with gold and deceit. The crowd did not know whether to sit or rise, whether to watch or turn away. Grace's calm defiance unsettled them more than a shouted accusation ever could. The bride clutched her bouquet tighter, her knuckles whitening, and Daniel forced his lips into a smile so rigid it looked more like pain than confidence. The priest's voice trembled as he tried to continue, but the words rang hollow in the charged air. What was meant to be a celebration of vows had become a silent theater of doubt. Daniel, unable to bear the weight of Grace's gaze upon him, gave a signal. 2 ushers moved discreetly, guiding Grace out of the hall under the pretense of respect. Yet everyone knew this was no gesture of honor. It was an escape, a desperate attempt to remove the shadow threatening to devour Daniel's carefully built light. The doors closed behind them, shutting out the murmurs of the guests. In the quiet of a side chamber, the mask fell away. Daniel's charm dissolved, leaving only raw anger. He turned on Grace, his voice low, sharp, the voice of a man used to controlling narratives, not facing them. But Grace did not flinch. She stood in the dim light of the chamber, steady, her hands folded, her eyes unwavering. Daniel's words spilled like venom, accusing her of bitterness, of desperation, of jealousy. He wanted her silence, her retreat, her shame. And then Grace revealed why she had come. Not with shouting, not with vengeance, but with evidence. She reached into her purse and laid a small envelope on the polished wooden table between them. Inside, photographs, documents, truths Daniel had hoped would never see light again. Deals made in shadows, lies told to climb ladders, betrayals deeper than the one he thought he could stage today. Daniel's bravado faltered. His hand hovered above the envelope but did not touch it, as if contact alone might burn him. For he realized in that instant that Grace had not come to beg or to weep. She had come prepared. The sound of footsteps echoed outside the chamber. Someone had followed. A tall woman in dark attire stepped into the doorway, silent, observant. Lena. Her presence deepened the unease. She said nothing, only watched, her eyes fixed on Daniel with a weight that made him shift uncomfortably. Who was she? Why was she here? Daniel's questions remained locked inside, but Grace already knew the answer. She had seen Lena before, in fragments of Daniel's hidden life, and now, at the very heart of his greatest performance, Lena had chosen to appear. The confrontation was no longer private. It was becoming a tribunal. Daniel's voice rose in protest, but the walls of that chamber seemed to close in on him. For the first time, the man who thought he held the strings realized he was trapped in a play he no longer controlled. Grace and Lena, two women from the shadows of his past, now stood together, silent, unyielding, and prepared to let the truth consume him. And outside, behind the closed doors, the guests waited, their whispers swelling into questions. They could sense the cracks forming. The groom had disappeared. The bride waited, uncertain. The ceremony hung suspended, like a candle in a draught, ready to be snuffed out by a single gust of truth. The chamber was heavy with silence, yet within that silence every heartbeat, every glance carried meaning. Daniel stood between two forces he never thought would align. Grace, the woman he had discarded, and Lena, the woman whose very presence unsettled him more than the photographs on the table. Grace had already played her hand, placing evidence of his betrayal in plain sight. But it was Lena's silence that frightened him most. She did not accuse. She did not argue. She simply watched, and in that watching, Daniel felt his empire crumbling. Finally, Lena moved. She stepped further into the room, closing the door softly behind her, as if to seal fate itself. Her voice, calm and deliberate, cut through the tension. She spoke of late-night meetings Daniel thought no one remembered, of promises whispered to women he never intended to keep, of fortunes built not on loyalty, but on exploitation. Daniel's face tightened. He demanded proof, but Lena had more than proof. She carried knowledge of his dealings, his betrayals, his cruelty. She had once been part of his climb, and now she stood as witness to his fall. Grace watched silently, allowing Lena's words to pour out like a quiet storm, and as they did, Daniel's bravado withered. His laughter was forced, his gestures unconvincing. The more he tried to deflect, the more the truth pressed in from every side. But beyond those walls, another drama was unfolding. The guests, restless and uneasy, had begun to speculate. Some whispered that Grace had caused a scandal. Others whispered louder that Daniel himself had secrets hidden behind those doors. The bride, her veil trembling, clutched her bouquet until petals broke away in her hands. She looked toward the chamber again and again, praying for her groom's return, yet sensing in her heart that the man she was about to marry was no longer who she believed him to be. The tension leaked from the chamber into the hall, spreading like smoke. Each minute Daniel remained absent fed the fire of suspicion. Wealthy allies exchanged uneasy glances, families whispered among themselves. The illusion of Daniel's perfection, once unshakable, was crumbling in real time. Inside, Daniel tried to regain control. He raised his voice, accused Grace of manipulation, accused Lena of betrayal. But the louder he spoke, the smaller he appeared. Grace remained calm. Lena, steady. And Daniel, despite all his power, looked more and more like a man cornered by truths he could no longer bury. The envelope on the table, the photographs within, Lena's testimony, they were not just weapons. They were a mirror reflecting back to Daniel everything he had tried to bury, and he hated what he saw. Outside, footsteps drew nearer. More guests approached the chamber, their curiosity stronger than their fear of impropriety. Soon the whispers would turn into demands. Soon the doors would open, and Daniel would face not just Grace and Lena, but an entire hall of witnesses ready to judge him. And as the doorknob rattled, Daniel's face drained of color. Because in that moment he understood. Humiliation would not come from Grace alone. It would come from everyone. The handle turned, and the door creaked open. What was meant to be a private confrontation spilled into the gaze of dozens of eyes. The ushers who had escorted Grace stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. And behind them, guests began to press forward, drawn by curiosity that no longer could be contained. The sight that greeted them was not the image Daniel had so carefully crafted. Gone was the confident groom, polished and untouchable. In his place stood a man flushed with anger, flustered, surrounded by two women who carried the weight of his secrets in their silence. Grace stood poised, her calm composure a striking contrast to his unraveling. Lena stood firm, her expression cutting deeper than words. A hush swept through the hall. The bride, pale and trembling, staggered closer, her voice catching in her throat as she tried to ask what was happening. But no one answered her. All eyes remained fixed on Daniel. Whispers rose like a tide. Why was his ex-wife here? Why was another woman in the chamber? Why was the groom so shaken? The perfect image Daniel had constructed was collapsing under the sheer weight of doubt. Then Grace spoke, not to Daniel, but to the crowd. Her voice, clear and steady, carried across the hall. She spoke of promises broken, of sacrifices made, of the way she had been cast aside once her purpose was served. She did not scream. She did not weep. She simply revealed the truth Daniel had worked so hard to bury, that his wealth had been built not through honor, but through betrayal. Gasps echoed. Some guests turned to leave, unwilling to be associated with such scandal. Others leaned in closer, hungry for every word. The bride dropped her bouquet, the flowers scattering across the marble floor. Daniel tried to speak, tried to silence Grace with interruptions and denials, but Lena stepped forward. Her voice joined Grace's, adding new layers to the testimony. She spoke of the women Daniel had deceived, the deals he had manipulated, the allies he had betrayed. Every word was a stone cast against the fragile glass of his reputation. And then, the envelope was opened. Photographs spread across the table, visible even to those at the doorway. Images of Daniel in places he swore he had never been, with people he claimed he never knew. Documents that tied his fortune to acts that could no longer be excused as ambition. The hall erupted. Some shouted. Some wept. The bride's family rose, demanding answers, their faces flushed with outrage. Daniel staggered backward, his hands trembling, his mouth opening and closing as though words might save him. Yet none came. The orchestra had stopped playing long ago. The laughter had died. The celebration was gone. What remained was a spectacle of downfall. Grace stood tall, her silence now more powerful than anything she could have spoken further. She had not come to beg. She had not come to fight for his attention. She had come to reveal. And as Daniel's empire of illusions crumbled around him, he finally understood. The stage he built to disgrace her had become the very altar of his own humiliation. But the night was far from over. For in the crowd, faces still watched with unreadable intent. Some were allies now turned enemies, and others, like Lena, carried secrets still untold. This was only the beginning of Daniel's unraveling. The scandal could not be contained. The hall that once echoed with music now pulsed with accusation and shame. Family members surged forward, their faces twisted with confusion and rage. Some demanded explanations, others demanded silence. But silence could no longer be bought. Daniel's father, a stern man who had once bragged about his son's rise, pressed him with sharp words. His mother, mortified, shielded her face from the guests she once courted with pride. The bride's family erupted, their matriarch's voice slicing through the chaos, denouncing Daniel for dragging their daughter into humiliation. The bride herself stood trembling, her veil slipping, her eyes wet with disbelief as the man she thought she loved was exposed before all. And yet, Grace remained steady. She did not raise her voice. She let the evidence speak, let the whispers swell, let the weight of truth crush Daniel's defenses one by one. Lena, too, unshaken, stood at her side like a shadow that would not be moved. The ushers tried to restore order, pleading with the crowd to return to their seats, but it was useless. The hall had become a court, and Daniel stood as the accused. His allies, men who once toasted his name, women who once praised his charm, shifted away, unwilling to be tainted by his collapse. One by one they distanced themselves, leaving him stranded in the very circle where once he had basked in admiration. Then came a sound that cut deeper than any word, the sharp echo of boots on marble. Security entered, their black uniforms breaking through the chaos, but they were not here to silence Grace. They did not move against Lena. Instead, they approached Daniel. The crowd hushed as one. Eyes widened. Whispers froze mid-sentence. The chief of security leaned close to Daniel, his tone calm but commanding. He had instructions, and they were not in Daniel's favor. Papers had been delivered earlier that morning. Papers Grace had arranged to surface at the exact moment the truth would be undeniable. These were no longer mere accusations whispered in shadows. These were formal complaints, sealed, signed, and waiting for the right eyes. Daniel's face drained of color as the realization struck him. His humiliation was not just social, it was legal. The crowd erupted again. Some gasped in sympathy, others smirked in satisfaction. The bride collapsed into her mother's arms, her sobs echoing through the chamber. Grace stood unmoving, her eyes fixed on Daniel, not with hatred, but with the calm certainty of justice fulfilled. Lena's gaze remained unreadable, but behind it was a quiet triumph, the satisfaction of truth finally brought to light. And in that moment, the man who had believed himself untouchable understood that every step he had taken to build this empire, every scheme he thought buried, every betrayal he thought forgotten, had returned to claim him. What was meant to be his crowning day had become his judgment day. And as security placed a hand on his shoulder, guiding him away from the altar that was never truly his, Daniel could no longer hold the mask. His composure shattered. His empire of lies collapsed. The hall was silent as the doors closed behind him. Silent, except for the murmurs of guests who would carry this story into every corner of society. Grace did not follow. She did not gloat. She had walked into this hall prepared to be shamed, yet left it as the one who revealed the truth. Her dignity remained untouched, her silence more powerful than any victory song. But this was not the end. For in the wake of Daniel's downfall, questions remained. Who else had known? How deep did his betrayals run? And what role would Lena, silent and watchful, play in the reckoning yet to come? Grace turned her back to the altar, her footsteps echoing against the marble as if the hall itself was listening. She moved with quiet resolve, each step measured, unhurried, refusing to let the spectacle bend her dignity. Her veil, once a symbol of surrender, trailed behind her like a banner of defiance. Lena followed, her expression unreadable, her presence like a shadow that had lingered too long in the corners of Daniel's story. Together, they walked through rows of guests whose faces were masks of disbelief. Some reached out as if to touch Grace, to speak, but the words died in their throats. None dared interrupt her procession. Behind them, chaos still churned. The bride's sobs clung to the air, her mother's cries sharp with outrage. Daniel's father barked orders no one obeyed. His voice had lost its authority. The weight of scandal stripped it bare. His mother, broken, trembled in her seat, whispering prayers that went unanswered. Grace did not turn back. She had seen enough. She had spoken enough. Her silence carried more power than their shouts. When she reached the doors of the hall, the great wooden frames loomed like a final barrier. For a moment, the world held still, and then, with a push of her hand, the doors swung open, Sunlight spilled in, a sharp contrast to the darkness behind her. She stepped into the light, and though the weight of betrayal still pressed upon her chest, there was no defeat in her walk. There was no shame. There was only a woman who had faced truth without fear. Lena's eyes scanned the crowd outside, reporters already gathering, cameras flashing as rumors had escaped quicker than the guests. They shouted Grace's name, demanded answers, begged for her side of the story. But she kept moving, her gaze fixed forward. She would not tell her story here. She would not waste her truth on vultures who fed on scandal. The truth had already spoken for itself. Inside, Daniel's world continued to fracture. His allies whispered in corners, deciding how quickly they could sever ties. Business partners dialed numbers under the table, distancing themselves before his empire collapsed. Some guests slipped away quietly, not wanting their names tied to the shame of his downfall, but others stayed, not out of loyalty, out of hunger. They wanted to witness the end. They wanted to see the mighty fall, to remember the details so they could retell them with precision, shaping themselves into eyewitnesses of history. Daniel himself sat hunched in the corner of the hall, abandoned, his hands trembling against his knees. The reality pressed in with suffocating force. His wedding was gone. His reputation was ruined. And worse, the walls of law and judgment were closing in. He raised his eyes, searching for Grace, but she was gone. All that remained was her silence, echoing louder than any accusation, and Lena. Watching him one last time before she too stepped through the doors, her look carried no pity, no mercy, only the weight of a truth he could never escape. The doors closed, sealing the divide. Inside, the empire of deception crumbled. Outside, the world waited to devour the story. And in the heart of it all, Grace knew, this was only the beginning. The sound of the heavy doors closing behind Grace was like the final stroke of judgment. Inside the hall, the echoes of chaos did not stop. They grew sharper, more desperate, clawing against walls that could no longer contain the disgrace. But outside, the air felt different, clean, almost fragile, as if the world itself paused to take note of what had just unfolded. Grace did not stop walking. The cameras pressed forward, voices rose in waves, microphones thrust like weapons in her direction. Questions flew at her, each one sharper than the last. Was this planned? Did you know beforehand? Will you press charges? But she did not answer. Her silence was her shield, her dignity her only weapon. She let the questions fall away like stones thrown at a wall too solid to crack. Lena stayed close, but a step behind, her face hidden beneath the brim of her hat. She knew the weight of these moments would follow Grace forever, etched into headlines, dissected in drawing rooms, twisted in the mouths of strangers who thrived on scandal. But still, Grace moved with quiet authority. And then, she stopped. Not at the steps of the grand cathedral, not before the line of cameras, but in the middle of the stone courtyard, where sunlight struck her face in full. She lifted her veil with steady hands, revealing eyes that held neither tears nor rage, only truth. The crowd hushed. Even the cameras, relentless and cold, seemed to hesitate. For the first time, Grace spoke. Her voice was steady, unshaken. "I gave him everything," she said, the words carried on the breeze like scripture. "And in return, he gave me lies, but today, the truth stood taller than deceit." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Reporters scribbled, cameras flashed, but her words were not for them. They were for the man behind the closed doors, for the family who had mocked loyalty, for the world that would judge her tomorrow. "Let it be known," she continued, her gaze never faltering, "that love cannot be built on falsehood, and those who trade loyalty for pleasure will reap the ashes of their own ruin." And with that, she lowered her veil again. She turned away from the flashing lights, away from the desperate shouts of questions that begged for more. She was finished speaking. Behind her, inside the hall, Daniel collapsed into a chair, his body heavy with the realization that Grace's words had already escaped beyond those doors. They would echo in every corner of the city, whispered in parlors, repeated in boardrooms, retold by strangers who would never know the full story, but they would know enough. Enough to strip him bare. Allies, once eager to tie themselves to his name, were already sending messages that distanced themselves from him. Bankers began calculating how much loss could be salvaged. Friends turned into witnesses, their loyalty crumbling under the weight of scandal. And the bride, the one who thought she had won, was left trembling in a corner, realizing she was no more than a footnote in a tragedy much larger than herself. Daniel pressed his palms against his face, but it was too late. The story had already left his grasp. It belonged to the world now. Grace, meanwhile, walked toward the waiting car at the end of the courtyard. She did not run. She did not tremble. Her pace was calm, steady, the pace of someone who had stared ruin in the face and chosen dignity instead. As she reached the car door, she hesitated just once, not in doubt, but in resolve. She looked back at the cathedral, at the towering structure that had seen betrayal and truth unfold under its roof. She knew history would remember this day, and she would not be remembered as a victim, but as the woman who walked away. The driver opened the door. Grace stepped inside, and with the soft click of the door closing, the chapter of her silence became the loudest testimony of all. Inside those walls where the music had been silenced, Daniel sat alone. The guests who once filled the hall with congratulations now whispered in corners, avoiding his eyes, as though proximity to him meant contamination. A few offered empty words of comfort, but even those words faltered halfway, replaced by excuses to leave quickly. The empire Daniel thought untouchable began to crumble in the span of hours. The investors who had attended the ceremony, men who had smiled at him, glasses raised in eager alliance, were already sending quiet messages to their associates. Withdraw. Step back. Do not be caught in his shadow. Business partners, sensing blood in the water, distanced themselves before the ink of scandal touched their own names. Contracts that had once seemed certain now stalled. Phones buzzed with apologies, excuses, and refusals. By evening, doors that had opened so easily to him for years began to shut one by one. And yet, the weight that crushed him most was not financial. It was the silence of his own family. His mother, who had once insisted on this grand marriage, would not look at him. His father, a man of few words, left the hall without saying a single thing, his back stiff, his steps heavy, the absence of his voice louder than any rebuke. But Grace's words, those few, deliberate sentences spoken beneath the sunlight, were the nail that held everything together. They spread like wildfire, retold by the very reporters who had come to document a celebration. By nightfall, they were headlines. "Truth stood taller than deceit," says bride who walked away. Editorials praised her composure, her dignity. Social gatherings repeated her speech word for word, her restraint becoming the symbol of strength Daniel could never crush. Meanwhile, Grace did not return to her home that night. The mansion, once gilded with promises, felt poisoned. She stayed instead at Lena's modest apartment, its walls humble, but its air free of deception. There, for the first time since the ceremony, she allowed herself to sit in silence, staring at the faint glow of the city through the window. Lena wanted to speak, to comfort, but she held back. She knew that Grace was not broken. She was becoming something else, something stronger. Far across the city, Daniel wandered through the empty corridors of his home. His steps echoed against marble floors that once symbolized triumph, now hollow reminders of a life unraveling. He thought of calling Grace, begging for forgiveness, but what words could he offer? He had traded truth for vanity, loyalty for indulgence, and now he stood with nothing but echoes and fading wealth. Days passed, and the world did what it always does. It judged. Strangers who had never met Grace spoke of her with reverence. her quiet defiance inspiring women who had suffered silently in the shadows of deceit. Daniel, meanwhile, became a subject of ridicule, his name tied to scandal in conversations that once celebrated him. His business sank further, invitations ceased, doors remained shut, and yet none of it weighed as heavily as the realization that Grace had left him not with bitterness, but with a dignity so complete it exposed the emptiness of his life more than rage ever could. Grace, in her silence, had spoken the loudest truth, and Daniel, in his disgrace, had no answer. Grace did not vanish into obscurity, as many had expected. Instead, her story grew beyond the confines of that ruined wedding. The world, it seemed, was waiting for someone like her, someone who could turn betrayal into a lesson of strength. At first it began quietly. A few articles highlighted her poise, the way she had faced humiliation without surrendering her dignity. Then came the interviews. She refused most of them, but the few she granted revealed a woman unafraid of truth, unashamed of pain, unwilling to let deceit dictate her worth. Her refusal to wallow in bitterness became her greatest weapon. Lena watched as Grace transformed. The sleepless nights did not break her, they sharpened her. Every tear shed in silence was followed by a day of resolve. She began working again, but not in the same way. No longer content to be a silent figure in the shadows of someone else's empire, Grace chose her own path. She invested her time into helping others, women who had been silenced, discarded, betrayed. Her story became a mirror in which countless others saw their own reflections. Letters arrived, messages poured in, strangers thanking her for the courage she displayed, for proving that dignity could outlive deceit. She did not set out to be a symbol, but symbols are rarely chosen. They are forged in moments where truth refuses to bow. Meanwhile, Daniel watched from a distance. The empire he had built stood on unsteady legs. Each day another fracture revealed. The press hounded him, investors fled, and his name became a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and social circles alike. His attempt to restore his image failed, for the world does not forgive hypocrisy easily, and while he could rebuild walls of stone and towers of glass, he could not rebuild what Grace had taken with her, the trust, the respect, the quiet power of integrity. It haunted him. At night, when the city's lights faded into the distance, he would recall the moment her eyes met his at the altar. She had not screamed, had not cursed him. She had simply spoken the truth, and in doing so, she had condemned him to a silence louder than any accusation. Grace, however, did not look back. She moved forward, step by step, building something that could not be purchased or lost to scandal. Her strength became her legacy. And though the world often seeks spectacle, what they found in her was something rarer, a quiet defiance, steady as stone, unshaken by betrayal. And so, while Daniel's empire sank beneath the weight of deception, Grace's life began to rise, fueled not by vengeance, but by the undeniable power of truth. Because in the end, wealth can be lost, empires can crumble, and reputations can vanish overnight. But character outlives them all. Grace did not seek the spotlight, yet it found her all the same. Invitations arrived at her doorstep, requests for her to speak at gatherings, to sit with women who had walked through similar valleys of betrayal, to lend her voice to causes where silence had long been the norm. At first, she hesitated. The wounds were still fresh, and her heart still bore the ache of shattered promises. But with each passing day, she realized that her story was no longer just hers. It belonged to countless others who had been left voiceless. She began to attend small events, standing before rooms filled with strangers whose eyes carried the weight of their own battles. She spoke simply, not as someone who claimed wisdom, but as someone who had lived through fire and refused to be consumed. Her words resonated, not because they were polished, but because they were real. Soon, those small gatherings grew into larger ones. Journalists who once wanted scandal now sought her for insight. Grace did not indulge them with gossip or bitterness. Instead, she spoke of resilience, of rebuilding, of finding worth beyond betrayal. It was this restraint, this refusal to let her story become another tabloid spectacle, that set her apart. And while the world listened, Daniel's silence grew heavier. He watched her ascend in ways he had never imagined. The woman he had underestimated, the woman he thought would crumble beneath the weight of humiliation, had become something he could never control, an emblem of strength, a voice for the broken, a figure whose light exposed his shadows. At first, he tried to discredit her. Whispers were planted, stories fabricated, yet none of it endured. For every false claim, there were dozens ready to stand for her, to defend her, to testify of her sincerity. In trying to destroy her, he only revealed more of his own emptiness. Grace, on the other hand, no longer looked for validation in the eyes of those who had betrayed her. She had discovered something deeper, the freedom that comes when one refuses to be defined by loss. And so, while Daniel's empire trembled, hers grew quietly, not in buildings or bank accounts, but in lives touched, in hearts restored, in hope reignited. There was an evening, months later, when Grace stood on a stage before a crowd larger than she had ever faced. The lights dimmed, the room fell silent, and she spoke of the wedding that never was. She did not recount it with bitterness, but with clarity. She told them how betrayal could either bind or free, and how truth, no matter how painful, would always be a doorway rather than a prison. The audience wept, not out of pity, but out of recognition, for in her story they found their own. And as she stepped down from that stage, the applause echoing behind her, Grace knew something profound. She had not only survived, she had transformed. What was meant to break her had instead carved her into something unshakable. Daniel, somewhere in the shadows, would hear of that night. And for him, the sound of her applause was louder than any condemnation, for it was the proof that in losing her, he had lost everything that truly mattered. Daniel's downfall did not come all at once. It came in pieces, each one cutting away at the image he had built so carefully. At first, there were whispers among his closest partners, small doubts about his judgment, questions about the choices he had made in business. Investors who once trusted him without hesitation began to hesitate. Invitations that used to arrive daily to the city's grandest halls grew fewer. The same smiles that once greeted him turned to polite nods, then to cold glances, and finally to absence. What the world saw was subtle: delayed projects, missed deadlines, and associates who began to distance themselves. But what Daniel lived was far more brutal. In boardrooms, men who once raised their glasses to his success now whispered behind closed doors, their words laced with suspicion and disdain. He heard fragments of conversations, half silenced when he entered the room, yet their meaning was unmistakable. His credibility was eroding. The unraveling did not stop there. Friendships he thought were unshakable revealed themselves for what they truly were: alliances of convenience. One by one, they disappeared, retreating to protect their own names. The grand circle that had once surrounded him shrank until there were only empty chairs at the table where laughter and promises once filled the air. And then came the final blow: his fortune. Numbers that had seemed untouchable began to shift. Investments soured, contracts slipped through his fingers, and debts he thought buried resurfaced with venom. Banks that once competed for his attention now treated him with cold formality. His empire, brick by brick, began to fall. But perhaps the sharpest cut of all was the silence from Grace. She did not speak his name in interviews, did not mention him in speeches, did not grant him the satisfaction of being remembered through her lips. She did not need to humiliate him. Her absence in his narrative humiliated him far more than words ever could. There were nights Daniel sat alone in his once bustling penthouse, the city lights flickering against the glass walls. He would pour himself a drink, stare at the skyline, and wonder how it had come to this. The man who once commanded rooms with his presence now wrestled with shadows of his own making. Every toast he once made, every promise he once broke, returned to him in the stillness, echoing louder than any applause he had ever received. And while he drowned in that silence, Grace's name filled the world, not in tabloids, but in testimonies, not in gossip, but in gratitude. Each life she touched became another reminder of the life he had squandered. In the end, Daniel discovered what so many learned too late, that power, wealth, and charm can crumble in an instant, but the consequences of betrayal linger far longer. He was left with his memories, his regrets, and a truth that no fortune could erase. He had lost Grace, and in losing her, he had lost everything that gave meaning to the empire he once ruled. But Daniel's story did not simply end in quiet ruin. A man who had once lived for the sound of applause does not accept silence easily. He tried, in his desperation, to claw back fragments of what he had lost. He reached out to partners, begging for one last deal. He called old friends, only to be met with excuses, or worse, unanswered phones. Doors that once swung open at his arrival now remained locked, guarded by men who would not even look him in the eye. At first he told himself it was temporary, that fortunes rose and fell, that he was clever enough, powerful enough, to rebuild. But each attempt ended the same way: rejection, avoidance, dismissal. The empire he once boasted of had left nothing but rubble, and the world had already moved on. Yet there was one thought that haunted him most, one name that rose above the din of failure: Grace. He could not escape her presence. Even when she was not in the room, she was there in the faces of those she helped, in the voices of strangers who praised her work, in the papers that celebrated her rise. In his most fragile moments, Daniel began to imagine her return. He pictured her walking through his door, forgiving him, saving him from the abyss. He told himself that if he could only explain, she would understand. He rehearsed the words late at night, whispering apologies into empty air, but Grace did not come. Instead, Grace was facing something Daniel could not see. Her success had made her a beacon, but it also drew shadows. Men who had once admired Daniel now sought to use her name, her influence, her compassion for their own gain. Invitations arrived not out of friendship, but out of calculation. Smiles masked hidden intentions. Grace, for all her strength, stood on a stage where every eye watched her, some with admiration, others with envy. It was in those moments of challenge that Grace revealed the very strength Daniel had underestimated. Where he had chosen deceit, she chose integrity. Where he had hidden truth, she spoke it plainly. Where he had sought to build a kingdom for himself, she built a foundation that carried others with her. And the contrast could not have been sharper. Daniel, alone in his echoing penthouse, nursing regrets he could not bury. Grace, surrounded by those who drew strength from her presence, her voice lifting lives he had once ignored. But fate, as it so often does, had one more turn to offer. For stories such as these rarely end with one voice silenced and the other triumphant. There are meetings arranged by chance, encounters no one plans, moments when past and present collide in ways that cannot be ignored. And so the question remains, when paths cross again, when Grace and Daniel stand face to face once more, will it be a moment of closure, or a spark that reignites a storm neither of them can control? The encounter did not come as Daniel imagined. There was no carefully rehearsed apology, no stage setting where he could control the moment. Instead, it happened by chance, or perhaps, as some would say, by inevitability. It was an evening heavy with expectation. A charity gala, one of those glittering events where fortunes were pledged with smiles, where music floated above hushed conversations, and where appearances mattered more than truth. Grace had been invited as the guest of honor, celebrated for the lives her foundation had touched, for the hope she had restored to a city that once bowed to Daniel's name. She stood beneath chandeliers that scattered light like fragments of stars, her presence commanding the room without effort. Every eye turned toward her, not out of obligation, but out of genuine reverence. She was what Daniel had always pretended to be, admired, respected, loved, and then he entered. Daniel had not been invited. He no longer belonged in such places, but pride, or perhaps desperation, carried him through the doors. Heads turned, whispers surged like a tide. Some gasped, others looked away, for here was a man who had been powerful, reduced to a shadow of himself, now daring to walk among those who once trembled at his nod. He moved slowly, his once tailored suit now ill-fitted, his eyes hollow yet burning with something no one could name. Each step toward Grace felt both defiant and pleading. The room seemed to hold its breath, as if sensing that this moment carried weight beyond a mere encounter. Grace saw him. For the briefest instant, her face betrayed nothing, no shock, no anger, no fear. She stood still, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. But within her silence lay the echo of every betrayal. Every night she had endured the pain he left behind. Daniel opened his mouth, words trembling at the edge of release. He had rehearsed this moment endlessly, but now, under the piercing clarity of her gaze, every practiced phrase dissolved. He reached out, hesitant, unsure, and Grace did not move. The silence stretched. The guests shifted uncomfortably, caught between curiosity and unease. They waited, as though the outcome of this exchange might decide more than just the fate of two souls. It might decide whether justice or forgiveness, truth or deception, would prevail in their own lives. Finally, Daniel spoke. His voice was low, cracked, burdened with a weight no riches could ever lift. "Grace, But she raised her hand, stopping him with a gesture that was neither cruel nor welcoming. And in that single motion, the room understood. This was not his stage anymore. Grace, her voice calm, yet edged with the authority of truth, answered only with words that cut deeper than any accusation. "Daniel, why are you here?" The hall froze. The question hung in the air, simple yet merciless, and as Daniel stood there, trembling, searching for an answer he could not form, it became clear that the night would not end as he hoped. For some returns are not redemptions, they are reckonings. Daniel stood in silence. The question lingered, heavier than the chandeliers above, sharper than the whispers darting across the room. He had expected resistance, perhaps even anger. But not this steady, unflinching demand for truth. Grace's eyes never left his. She waited, not out of curiosity, but as if she already knew the answer and was testing whether he would dare speak it aloud. His lips parted, yet no words came. The years had stolen his eloquence. The collapse of his empire had stripped him of the language of power. All that remained was a hollow voice, shaking under the weight of shame. I came because—" The words faltered, dissolved. His throat closed against the truth he feared to admit. And in the silence that followed, the air seemed to press closer around him, as if the entire hall demanded his confession. Grace tilted her head, just slightly, as though listening for something hidden beneath his hesitation. The guests, frozen in a circle of unspoken judgment, watched without moving, their wine glasses untouched, their breaths shallow. No one dared to interrupt. Finally, Daniel forced sound from his chest. "I came because, without you, there is nothing left." His voice cracked. It was not the declaration of a man seeking love, nor the prideful defense of a fallen king. It was the naked plea of someone who had lost everything but the memory of what he once had. For a moment, the hall seemed to soften. Some faces shifted, pity flickering against disdain. Yet Grace did not move. Her hands remained at her sides, her expression still, as though she were weighing the very soul of the man before her. Then, her voice, calm, measured, unyielding. "Nothing left, Daniel? Or nothing left that belongs to you?" The words struck like a quiet thunder, echoing deeper than any shouted accusation. His head dropped, unable to withstand the force of her gaze. "You had everything," she continued, her tone carrying both sorrow and steel. "And you used it to take, to consume, to destroy. You left ruins where there should have been life, and now you stand here, speaking of loss. Tell me, Daniel, what do you imagine I should give you now?" Daniel's shoulders trembled. His fingers clenched at his sides, as if holding on to the last shreds of dignity. Yet there was none to grasp. He looked up, desperation etched across his hollow features. "A chance," he whispered. "Just one." The room waited for her reply, and when it came, it did not roar. It cut, quiet and final. "Chances," Grace said, "are not infinite. Some expire the moment they are betrayed." The words settled into the silence, a verdict spoken without ceremony. Daniel closed his eyes, his face collapsing into the weight of a truth he could no longer escape. And the room knew redemption would not be granted here tonight. Daniel's face was no longer the polished mask of a man who once commanded rooms with a single glance. No, this was different. His jaw, once set with confidence, quivered ever so slightly. His eyes, rimmed with red, darted between Grace and the guests, searching for some fragment of sympathy, some flicker of rescue. But none came. The light from the chandelier above caught the sheen of sweat on his temple, the beads tracing downward like the slow descent of a man who had lost the strength to hold himself upright. His lips trembled as though every word was weighed against a lifetime of regret, yet all that escaped was the faintest, broken whisper. I never meant for it to end this way." Grace's eyes did not soften. They narrowed, not in anger but in something far colder. Recognition. Recognition of the man before her, stripped bare of his illusions. She leaned forward just slightly, her voice lower now, meant for him and him alone, though the entire room strained to hear. "End this way? Daniel, it was never about the ending. It was about every choice you made to get here." Her words struck deeper than any public humiliation could, because in that close space between them, in the charged silence where only their breathing seemed to exist, she was no longer speaking as a scorned woman. She was speaking as the mirror he had avoided his entire life. Daniel's eyes wavered, moisture gathering at the edges, though he fought against it. His mouth opened once more, but no defense came. Only silence. And in that silence, his face betrayed everything he had tried so desperately to conceal. The loneliness, the fear, the collapse of a man who had finally been seen for what he truly was. Grace did not flinch. Her gaze remained fixed, unrelenting, her words quiet yet merciless. "You ask for a chance, but Daniel, tell me, when did you ever give one?" The close of her question lingered between them like a blade held inches from his chest. Daniel's head bowed, and in that single motion, the last fragment of his pride seemed to fall away. The silence in that room was unlike any other silence before it. No whispers, no shifting feet, no forced coughs to break the tension. Just a stillness so sharp it pressed against every heart. Daniel remained bowed, the weight of his choices pressing him lower than any hand ever could. And Grace. Grace stood tall, unyielding, her voice the final echo that marked the close of their story. "This was never about love alone," she said softly, almost to herself, though every soul present clung to each syllable. "It was about trust, and once broken, trust does not return." Her words did not scream, but they struck harder than any shout could. Daniel lifted his eyes one last time, searching for something, perhaps mercy, perhaps forgiveness, but found only the emptiness his own actions had created. The guests, still frozen in their seats, had witnessed not just a confrontation, but a revelation. They would leave that room forever changed, burdened with the knowledge that beneath every celebration, beneath every polished smile, there may lie secrets waiting to be unearthed. And as Grace walked away, her steps steady, her head high, one truth remained unshakable. The story was no longer his to control. Now, I leave you with a question. One only you can answer. If you were standing in Grace's place, would you have walked away as she did? Or would you have stayed to face the ruins together? Think carefully before you answer, and let your voice be heard below. And so Grace's footsteps carried her away, steady and unbroken. Each stride was not simply a step, it was a declaration, a refusal to be chained to a betrayal that could never be undone. Daniel remained behind, a shadow of the man he had once pretended to be, staring into the silence that now belonged to him alone. But what about you? Yes, you watching this right now. Put yourself there, in the very heart of that moment. Imagine the air heavy around you, the eyes of hundreds upon you, the weight of years pressing on your shoulders. What would you have done if it was your wedding day? If the person you trusted most in the world tore the veil away from your future in front of everyone you loved? Would you have walked away like Grace, head held high, leaving behind a trail of dignity and finality? Or would you have stayed, facing the ruins together, hoping, praying, that somehow the shattered pieces could still be mended? Do not answer quickly, because this is not just their story, it is a reflection of countless lives, countless choices, countless hearts torn between pride and forgiveness. Think of your own scars, your own crossroads, your own secrets. Now I want you to tell me below, which path would you have taken, and why? And if this story gripped you, if it made you stop and question the very nature of trust and betrayal, then I ask you, don't just watch in silence. Share your thoughts in the comments, let your voice join this conversation, and above all, subscribe. Because here, we uncover the stories that others hide, the ones that test the heart, expose the soul, and leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Your silence keeps these stories buried, your voice brings them to life. So choose, will you remain a spectator, or will you step into the story?